Hello everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Dr. Mohammad Suhail Khan. In this particular session, I will be talking about compensation administration. Just to have a brief introduction that where the compensation administration fits into the whole HRM process. So most of the HRM text talks about the basic HRM functions. Then they move towards the strategic HRM functions where they talk about the strategic alignment of the functions with the corporate strategy. Then it moves towards the HRM planning and job analysis. Somehow they move to the recruitment process. After the recruitment, there is a selection process. After the selection process, most of the text talks about the socialization and the career management topics related to HR. Once the career management topic is finished, the text basically moves towards the performance management, and then they talk about the establishing and managing rewards. So compensation administration basically is kind of a subcategory of this establishing and management rewards category. So what is compensation management? So before going into the details of what is compensation management, let's talk about why compensation management or compensation administration is really important for the organizational point of view. So for example, I think so it's kind of really clear that most of the employees really work in the organization because they want to earn for their living. So compensation is kind of one of the really important category or really important tool for an employee. In terms of organization, the compensation administration basically attracts, motivates, and retains the employee. So employee retention is one of the really basic elements of organizational structure. So most of the organization really try hard in terms of retaining the employees, and most importantly the competent employees. So compensation administration is kind of a process in terms of managing the whole compensation program. The compensation program needs to be fair, because only the fair program somehow balance in terms of attracting, motivating, and retaining the employees. One of the major considerations for the organization is that most of the organization, if not all, really tries to pay the least possible to minimize the cost. So for example, most of the organizations are considering their ROI, like their return on investment. So most of the organizations really think in terms of paying very less amount to the employees, so that from that perspective they thought that they can minimize the cost. However, the minimizing of cost doesn't mean that the compensation or the pay structures of the employees should not be fair. It means that the employees of any organization shouldn't be getting lesser amount of what is expected in that region or in that kind of employment. So the structure of the compensation program needs to be really fair if an organization really wants to attract, motivate, and retain the employee. In terms of fairness means that it is kind of a two-way street. It means that it should be done in a fair way, and it should be perceived as a fair from the employee's perspective as well. So if you just think fairness is kind of a two-way street, one of the theories that is coming in my mind is basically a social exchange theory. So social exchange theory talks about if you do good for me, I will return that favor. So fairness should be thinking in that perspective. If the employees are thinking that, if the employees are perceiving that they are getting enough pay, or they are getting at least the market comparable pay, then definitely they will work harder, and it will definitely help organizations to getting its goals. But now the question is, or the big question is, that from where the compensation basically starts. So the companies basically, or the organizations basically, drive the compensation programs from the job evaluation. So somehow, if you remember, the job evaluation is basically talks about what kind of tasks are involved in a particular job. So job evaluations basically defines the appropriate worth of each job or each task that is involved in that particular job. So compensation administration is somehow directly related to the job evaluation. So now the big question is that how companies derive the compensation program. So somehow the compensation program is directly related to the job evaluation of any particular job. So for example, job evaluation is one of the procedures that derives or that defines the appropriate worth of each job. So once, if you just remember that job evaluation is somehow talks about the what are the tasks that is involved in terms of completing one particular job. So job evaluation will give us some kind of idea that what kind of job it is, how much effort that is needed in terms of completing that job, what kind of knowledge and skills is required in terms of completing that job. So job evaluation is somehow directly related to the compensation administration. So the difficult the job, the scope of the knowledge that is required for that particular for doing that particular job is the higher will be the compensation program. So job evaluation is somehow directly related to the compensation administration. However, it doesn't mean that each and every job basically have the same amount of worth. It means so we have to look at the type of the job basically, the knowledge and skills that is involved in the job, the time that job is basically taking in terms of completing, and most importantly, how much effort is needed in terms of completing that particular job. So before going into the details of job evaluation procedure, I thought that it would be easier in terms of understanding that what different types of acts talks about the pay structures of the compensation programs of any particular employee. So according to the Fair Labor Standard Act, or what we can call FLCSA, it basically requires that every employee should be given at least a minimum wage. So every employee should have an opportunity to get an overtime pay if it's applicable in that particular environment. All the pays, all the wage should be keep in record. So all the pays structure should be a part of the record keeping structure. And also there is some kind of child labor restriction, that what kind of child or what kind of people according to which age they can basically work. So Fair Labor Standard Act basically talks about those four elements. It talks about the child labor restrictions, it talks about the record keeping, that why and how the employees' pay should be recorded. It also talks about the overtime pay structure. So for example, when an employee would be eligible for overtime. So for example, if an employee is if somehow the standard time limit of any particular employee is 40 hours per week, but for example, if somehow the employees are putting more than 40 hours, then they are kind of eligible for overtime pay. And most importantly, FLSA talks about that every employee should be at least paid a minimum wage. Similarly, there is an Equal Pay Act structure. So for example, in USA, that act basically talks about that employees should not be discriminated on the basis of gender. So for example, employees would be paid in terms of equal amounts despite of any gender that they belong to. So for example, not any organization can really discriminate between two employees in terms of gender. So it doesn't mean that you're that any organization is paying less to the women or more to the women, or less to the men or more to the men. So both the genders should be, or each gender or any sexual orientation needs to be really taken care of in terms of the Equal Pay Act. Also, the salaries established should be based on the skills, responsibilities, effort, and working conditions. So, if we just really see the big pillars of the pay structure, so it would be skill, it would be responsibility, it would be effort, and it would be the working condition under which the employees are basically working in that particular environment. So, in short, Equal Pay Act talks about the equal pay off for equal work. Let's now talk about the job evaluation and the pay structures. So as I already mentioned, that job evaluation basically talks about the job analysis, that what kind of task or what kind of skills or knowledge basically one of the job requires. So job analysis or job evaluations talks about the job duties, authority of the relationships, for example in terms of command and control, what kind of skills that are required for the job, and what kind of conditions of work that is being expected, or that is basically under which conditions that employees will be working. So job analysis basically talks about four major components: job duties, what are the tasks that is involved in terms of completing that particular job, what are the relationships or the authority, so for example what are the command, what are the structures of command, what are the skills that are needed in terms of managing or guiding people. So that kind also includes the leadership skills. So for example, in which kind of hierarchical structures that particular employee will be working in, what kind of supervisors that will be involved in terms of supervising or managing that particular employee, what kind of skills or educations basically needed for that particular job to be completed, and under which conditions that work needs to be done. Also, there are a couple of other factors in terms of establishing the pay structures. One of the couple of major important factors will be the labor market conditions, or collective bargaining, or individual skill difference. So for example, if we just think in terms of labor market conditions, so for example if any employee had a knowledge that is kind of rare in terms of labor market, definitely that employee will be pay higher than the other employees. In terms of bargaining powers can also talks about in terms of the so there could be two dimensions in terms of thinking about the bargaining power. So collective bargaining power could be a result of the experience that any particular employee that has, or collective bargaining power could also be a result of the union structures. So for example, if there is a more bargaining power of that particular employee, definitely the employee will be getting a higher pay. Again, the individual skill difference, that is kind of a base for everything. So if an individual is being differentiated in terms of the skill level, definitely that individual will be getting the higher pay. So depending on all the other structures, for example if the job evaluation structures is already there, the pay structures also depends on some kind of labor market condition, or the collective bargaining structures, or also depending on the individual skills differences. Now let's talk about the couple of methods that has been used in terms of job evaluation. So now we have to remember that we are talking about the job evaluation. So how the job is being evaluated, and consequently that how these jobs will be related, will be somehow resulted into the establishing the pay structure. So one of the method of evaluating the job will be the ordering method. So for example, in the ordering method, all the jobs basically rank in order. So for example, highest job will be somehow ranked in number one, then there's a space for the lower job, then lower job, and then kind of a lowest job. So the jobs will be basically placed from highest to lowest. So highest to lowest so one of the criteria of putting the jobs from highest to lowest would be the importance of job. So how much the importance of job is, that job is basically considered the highest job, or the difficulty in terms of performing the job. So two main criteria: importance of, difficulty of performing. Second method would be classification method. So somehow the jobs are basically classified into some kinds of based on some kinds of skills, knowledge, or responsibilities. So in terms of understandings, the jobs are basically placed into grades, and then those grades are basically compared to the benchmark jobs. So one of the classification would be based on the skills or the knowledge or the responsibility. So for example, if we just think of grade 7 versus grade 20 jobs. So grade 7 jobs is somehow needs lesser skills, somehow lesser knowledge, and definitely lesser in terms of responsibility as well. So that's how the grade 7 and grade 20 jobs somehow differentiate between each other. The last method is basically what we call point method. In that particular method, jobs are basically rated according to the points, or what we can say, the points are basically allocated to the jobs. So the points are allocated to different criteria of the job. So for example, points will be given to the skills, that what kind of skills is needed to complete that particular job, or what kind of responsibilities basically that is needed to complete the job, or effort. So for example, if we have a job that needs a skill level of for example say 5, or the average skill level, so the 5 points will be given to that particular skills area. Again, if the job needs a higher responsibility, so for example, the 8 points may be given to the responsibility area. And if there is a number of hours per week is basically 60 compares to the 40 working hours per week, then we may need to assign 9 points to, or 10 points to that particular effort criteria. So for example, the jobs are somehow allocated points based upon the importance of the skills, responsibilities, or effort. And after once all those points will be allocated, all the jobs that has the similar point total. So for example, if say for example, if somehow the software engineering job, or any academic sector job, as basically both of them somehow got the 70 out of for example 80, so both of those kinds of jobs will be placed in the same pay grade. So you may be expecting that software engineering was also earning 90k, and at the same time an academician is also getting a 90k. So if we just try to compare those two categories, maybe the skills or the responsibilities or the efforts would be different, or the responsibility or skills level will be different, but in terms of understanding or in terms of allocation of the points, both of those type of jobs are basically got the same amount of points. That's why there is a need to place both of those jobs into the same pay grades. So once the job evaluation procedure is being done, then there's a process of establishing the pay structures. So whatever the methods that particular organization has used or had used in terms of evaluating or evaluating the job or doing the job analysis, somehow those evaluation structures basically now being compared to different organizational pay rates. So for example, there would be surveys that needs to be consulted in terms of the pay structures. Remember, the job evaluations procedures only helped in terms of evaluating the jobs. We did not talk about the pay rates at this time. So the compensation surveys, or looking at the similar kinds of job, basically somehow gives some idea for that particular organization that what kind of pay rates would be expecting for those particular kind of jobs. Once the pay rates has been determined from the surveys or from comparing it with different organizations, most of the organizations basically plots the job evaluation data with the actual pay rates, and somehow they try to look at the pay in terms of the logical pay structure. So for example, they will be thinking in terms of whether that particular job is somehow is eligible to get those kinds of pay rates. Again, the pay rates is kind of subjective as well. So for example, maybe those particular organization would not be able to pay the same kind of pay rates that is basically expected from other companies. So for example, if we'll just take an example of a software engineer, we won't expect that the software engineer that is working in the Google is getting the same amount of pay. For example, if any other particular software engineer is working in a remote area in some third world country, for example, they basically they basically have the same skill, they basically have the same responsibility, or even then they are putting the same job effort into their jobs, but it is also subjective according to the environment of the organization, according to the reputability of that organization, and also according to what organization can really pay to those particular employees. From all those data, basically the job curves is being determined, that how much any particular organization can pay to some kind of job. After that, the wage structures is defined or designates. So for example, wage structures basically designates the pay ranges for the similar kinds of job. So the jobs that are somehow has the same kind of responsibility are basically be putting into the same kind of wage structures. Another important point in terms of establishing the pay structures would be influence of the external factors into the pay structure. So for example, the pay structures is also somehow got influenced from the geographical location. So for example, as in the previous slide, I gave an example of an employee working in Google, or an employee doing the same kind of job or working in the same kind of industry into the remote area of any third world country. So somehow they would be getting the same amount of salary. So somehow the geographical difference also somehow discriminate or differentiate between the pay structures. Again, an important criteria that needs to be considered is also about the labor supply. Labor supply means that for example, if there's a low supply of employees or the skills that is needed to complete a job, and the higher will be the wage or pay. And again, and it's basically vice versa as well. So for example, if there's more supply of employees or the more supply of knowledge and skills in terms of completing that job, the wages or the salaries will be lower. Sometimes there is a competition. So for example, if there is an organization A and an organization B, an organization A is somehow hiring any employee, they are also looking their competitor salary. So for example, organization A will be paying more if their comparable organization, say organization B is paying to that particular employee. An easy analysis in terms of understanding this competitive mechanism will be thinking in terms of why employees switch from say organization A to organization B. Most of the organization are trying to be really comparable with each other. However, one of the reason of switching from one organization to another would be the higher job wages or higher job salaries as well. So in terms of competition or wage structure or salary structures, the direct competitors basically talks about what kind of pay or salaries or incentives that they can give to their to the employees so that they can lead their competitors. So in that particular theme, an organization or HR can basically match, lead, or lag the salaries, lag in terms of pay or salary structures. And also one of the important thing in terms of considering the pay structures will be, or the defining the pay structures would be the thinking about the cost of living. So for example, if someone is living into the big city and another person who's living into the remote area may not be getting the same kind of pay or same kind of salary, because the cost of living differentiates between those two kinds of employees. I already talked about these bargaining powers in terms of union. So once the job evaluation procedure is being done, then there's a process of establishing the pay structures. So whatever the methods that particular organization has used or had used in terms of evaluating or evaluating the job or doing the job analysis, somehow those evaluation structures basically now being compared to different organizational pay rates. So for example, there would be surveys that needs to be consulted in terms of the pay structures. Remember, the job evaluations procedures only helped in terms of evaluating the jobs. We did not talk about the pay rates at this time. So the compensation surveys or looking at the similar kinds of job basically somehow gives some idea for that particular organization that what kind of pay rates would be expecting for those particular kind of jobs. Once the pay rates has been determined from the surveys or from comparing it with different organizations, most of the organizations basically plots the job evaluation data with the actual pay rates, and somehow they try to look at the pay in terms of the logical pay structure. So for example, they will be thinking in terms of whether that particular job is somehow is eligible to get those kinds of pay rates. Again, the pay rates is kind of subjective as well. So for example, maybe those particular organization would not be able to pay the same kind of pay rates that is basically expected from other companies. So for example, if we'll just take an example of a software engineer, we won't expect that the software engineer that is working in the Google is getting the same amount of pay. For example, if any other particular software engineer is working in a remote area in some third world country, for example, they basically they basically have the same skill, they basically have the same responsibility, or even then they are putting the same job effort into their jobs, but it is also subjective according to the environment of the organization, according to the reputability of that organization, and also according to what organization can really pay to those particular employees. From all those data, basically the job curves is being determined that how much any particular organization can pay to some kind of job. After that, the wage structures is defined or designates. So for example, wage structures basically designates the pay ranges for the similar kinds of job. So the jobs that are somehow has the same kind of responsibility are basically be putting into the same kind of wage structures. Another important point in terms of establishing the pay structures would be influence of the external factors into the pay structure. So for example, the pay structures is also somehow got influenced from the geographical location. So for example, as in the previous slide, I gave an example of an employee working in Google, or an employee doing the same kind of job or working in the same kind of industry into the remote area of any third world country. So somehow they would be getting the same amount of salary. So somehow the geographical difference also somehow discriminate or differentiate between the pay structures. Again, an important criteria that needs to be considered about is also about the labor supply. Labor supply means that for example, if there's a low supply of employees or the skills that is needed to complete a job, and the higher will be the wage or pay. And again, and it's basically vice versa as well. So for example, if there's more supply of employees or the more supply of knowledge and skills in terms of completing that job, the wages or the salaries would be lower. Sometimes there is a competition. So for example, if there is an organization A and an organization B, an organization A is somehow hiring any employee, they are also looking their competitor salary. So for example, organization A will be paying more if their comparable organization, say organization B, is paying to that particular employee. An easy analysis in terms of understanding this competitive mechanism will be thinking in terms of why employees switch from say organization A to organization B. Most of the organization are trying to be really comparable with each other. However, one of the reason of switching from one organization to another would be the higher job wages or higher job salaries as well. So in terms of competition or wage structure or salary structures, the direct competitors basically talks about what kind of pay or salaries or incentives that they can give to the employees so that they can leave their competitors. So in that particular theme, an organization or HR can basically match, lead, or lag the salaries, lag in terms of pay or salary structures. And also one of the important thing in terms of considering the pay structures will be, or the defining the pay structures would be the thinking about the cost of living. So for example, if someone is living into the big city and another person who's living into the remote area may not be getting the same kind of pay or same kind of salary, because the cost of living differentiates between those two kinds of employees. I already talked about these bargaining powers in terms of union. Somehow pays are not just pays or wages or salaries. Sometimes employees basically in terms of retaining the employees, organizations also talks about different pay structures. So now we'll talk about somehow the special cases of compensation. So sometimes incentives can be also added into the basic pay structures, and it depends on the organizations and the kinds of employees that the organization basically needs. So somehow employees are not getting their basic pays only, but they are also getting something in terms of incentive. So the common incentives that basically the literature talks about are incentive or compensation plans. So incentive compensation plans can be about the individuals, or they can be a group-based compensation or incentive plans, or also they can be organizational incentive compensation programs. At the same time, there's a whole literature that talks about the paying for performance plans. So it can be performance-based plans. It can depends on the team competence. It can depends on the employee owns competence. Hopefully, this session will provide you some kind of understanding that how organization basically establish their pays and what are the different methods that they use in terms of evaluating the jobs, and also most importantly how job analysis somehow directly related to with the compensation administration. And thank you very much.